Rich, tell us a little bit about your early years, where you were born and raised, and then I'll ask a couple other questions.
Okay, I grew up right here in the area, Willowick. Spent probably the majority of my life in the Wickliffe-Willowick area. I was brought up Catholic. I had a good upbringing, good parents who they tried their best. They had such high hopes for me. It was sad to be such a letdown, but we went to church every week. We did all the right things. I was brought up with morals and principles and ethics and all that. But that was not to be the case as years went by. By the time my teenage years came, was where I made the discovery about drugs. I was probably 14 the first time I took something that was mind-altering, mood-altering. That was to begin a journey that went on for another 14 years. I wound up in jail probably over 50 different occasions. I've had 3 different prison numbers in the state of Ohio. I overdosed 3 different times, wound up in Lake County West over here with all kinds of tubes and wires going in and out of me, and had no clue how I got there. One time I remember jumping up on the bed and hollering like, "What am I doing here?" And the nurse came in and said, "Well, take it easy. You've been here 3 days already." And I was like, "Oh man," I not even knowing how I got there. I would wonder, like, did I? And of course, there was a police officer posted outside my door, and I knew he wasn't there for my protection. If I didn't live, oh well. If I did survive, I was going to prison again. But that was a picture of my life. All during this time, I have to say, I can look back now and see how the Lord God had his hand on my life, because people kept getting put in my path. Back then we called them Jesus freaks. But I was always finding a tract somewhere in my vicinity. I would run into a lot of people telling me I needed to be saved, and at first I wondered, saved from what, They, even in the jail, that was pretty much my home away from home as often as I was there. There were 3 preachers who came up there faithfully. I have to give credit to these men every Sunday to preach the gospel. And I'm real ashamed to say today that, how we laughed at these guys. We cussed at them, Back then you could have cans of pop, different prisoners would throw pop cans at them and spit on them. But every week these men came to preach the gospel to us. And I would, you couldn't help, you had to listen. You couldn't get away from it. But I can see how the Lord had his hand on my life. He used these men in my life. And it was years later, to fast forward to November 5th of 1980 was where it all came to an end. I got arrested again for probably close to the 60th time in my life. I was still on parole from getting out of prison the last time, which was January of 1980. In November of 1980 was where I wound up back incarcerated. And it just really hit me. I mean, this was the worst. I can't even begin to describe the feelings and thoughts that were going through my head at that time. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to die. I didn't know what I wanted to do. All I knew was I couldn't do this anymore. And I remembered those guys that came up there to the jail. And I specifically requested, to see one of them. Now, at this time, I was on like a maximum security range because in 1974, I had escaped from Lake County Jail. And when they brought me back here, I was considered high risk. So the preacher didn't have access to that part of the jail unless you specifically asked for them. So that was November 5th when I got arrested the last time. November 9th was the first Sunday after that. And I knew the preachers were going to be up there. And all that day I was beside myself. Every time one of the corrections officers came in there, I said, look, when that preacher gets there, I have to see that preacher. You know, make sure he gets up here when he arrives to the jail. And I just kept at him. Every time they came in, I'd remind them. And by that, you know, they had to wonder, like, well, what's wrong with this guy? You know, I had never been like this before. And what was wrong with me, they couldn't see. It was inside of me. I just like, it was like a light bulb went off inside. I just knew what I had to do, that I was a sinner, and I needed to be saved from my sin and from myself, or I was never going to make it. You know, people said I would never see age 30, and I'm very pleased to say that the Lord has allowed me and blessed me with 7 decades of life. I'm like in 40 years overtime, you know, by the grace of God.
Rich, we put up your prison photo. I had asked for Rich's.
Did they
Yeah, we put it up there. It was pretty scary looking at her.
Yeah.
It looked like Charles Manson's brother
so
there.
People who said, I looked like Charles Manson back then, but that was, when I escaped, I went to California, and that picture is also Gilbert Henry Nesbitt. That was my alias. And that's a real person, by the way. I had met on my travels on the way out to California. He was a foreign exchange student from Belfast, and he was kind enough to allow me to use his temporary ID when we were heading to California. And so that's who I became for that time when I was a fugitive. But yeah, it's been a real interesting life. You know, I've had the good, the bad, and the ugly. You know, my parents lived long enough to see me get clean and come to know the Lord. You know, I remember, you know, I call them 3 prayer warriors in my life. Was my mom, my aunt, you know, her sister, and my grandma, their mother. These ladies, every time I would get arrested, they just would always send me a letter and, you know, P.S., we're praying for you. We're praying for you. You know, I never thought much about it back then at that time, but I have to give credit to them for, you know, praying me into where I'm at today. So it just shows, you know, the power of prayer and not to give up on people. You know, there's that one more word, you know, that one more thing that you could say or do that's going to open the eyes of someone to see the Lord, to come to know the Lord. When I first came to know the Lord, I was like a kid in a candy store. I mean, I couldn't say enough. I couldn't do enough. I wanted everybody to know about this thing that I had discovered. You know, I would run into my old drug friends, and they would ask me, like, you want to smoke a doob? And then they'd say, oh, that's right, you can't get high anymore. And I would look at them, and I'd smile, and I'd say, I don't have to get high anymore. You know, that was my answer to them. The last time I had to go to court, even after I came to get the Lord in my life on November 9th of 1980, like I said, I was on parole. I still had charges facing me. And some of those charges got dismissed. But I remember praying a real simple prayer. It was just before the holidays. It's like I could never make it to the holidays. I'd always get arrested sometime in October, November. I can't tell you how many Christmases and Thanksgivings and New Year's I spent behind bars. And I prayed a real simple prayer after I, came to know the Lord. Another thing I want to share too real quick is that, I always remember the Bible being talked about as the living word. And that day, it was like the Samaritan woman at the well, and Jesus said, if you had asked, I would have gave you water so you would never thirst. And that day when the Holy Spirit came into my life was the day that unquenchable thirst for alcohol and drugs went out, never to be seen or heard from again. I'm just, I can't be grateful enough. But the holidays were coming, and I prayed a real simple prayer, and I said, Lord, if there's any way that I can get out of here and be home with my family for Christmas, let it happen. And I know I'm going to get choked up telling this because I do all the time. Just before Christmas, a few days before Christmas, they came upstairs. Now, when you're on parole, even if your charges are all dismissed, they put what they call a holder on you. And that means even, you're not going anywhere. Your parole officer puts that hold on you. They can still violate your parole and send you back. And the corrections officer came up there and he says, Chinchar, roll up your gear. You're going home. And I just was baffled because I still had charges yet that I hadn't answered to. But I didn't question it. I was just, I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, there's got to be a mistake. And he came back up, and I rolled up my gear, and I'm going downstairs. And I thought any minute they're going to say, oh, we made a mistake. We have to turn around and go back upstairs. And my heart would have sank, but the whole thing proceeded to happen. And he looked at me when I got arrested. It wasn't quite that cold out yet. I just was in tennis shoes and a sweatshirt. And he says, well, do you have anybody to pick you up? I said, well, no, everybody's at work. And he says, well, it's really cold outside. And I said, I don't care. He said, well, it was snowing out there. It's covered with snow. And I said, I don't care. Just get me out of here. And so I did get out, and I had to hitchhike. I walked up to Richmond Street in Painesville, and I can even see now how the Lord orchestrated this. I stuck out my thumb to hitchhike, and a truck picked me up and asked me where I was going. My mom at this time worked at Woolworths up at Shoregate Shopping Center. And this fella is going to make a delivery at Shoregate Shopping Center. And took me right, to where my mom worked. And I walked in, and of course, I wasn't supposed to be out. This wasn't supposed to happen. And my mom looked at me, and she had this scared look on her face like I escaped again. And I told her, I said, no, take it easy, Mom. I says, everything's all right. They let me out. They let me come home. And
Amen.
So I'll, fast forward a little bit. At that time, when I got out of prison, a fella brought me here to, at that time was New Testament Fellowship. And I became involved. I came every Sunday. I wasn't quite there yet because I messed up a lot for the remainder of 1980. And I had got an introduction to, 12-step programs. I went to meetings and things like that. Well, after I got out, that Christmas Eve miracle, I call it, and it truly was a miracle. I tried to tell my parents this, they let me come back home. I says, well, I still have these unanswered charges. I says, there's going to come a day and a time I'm going to have to answer to those. And so I went to meet, I didn't need anybody to tell me what to do. I was at church every Sunday. I wanted to go. It's not like, well, I have to. I went to meetings, 8, 9, 10, 12-step meetings a week. And finally the day came on February 5th of 1981. The phone rang and it said, well, this is the East Lake Police. We want you to come down here and turn yourself in. We still have some unfinished business. And I almost like felt that call coming in. I looked at my mom and I said, well, I have to go. And at that time I thought, well, what do I need? I grabbed my toothbrush and toothpaste. I had the want ads from the paper because I was out looking for work constantly, and I had my Bible. And that's all I need. I'm probably not going to walk out of there. And I actually had to hitchhike to go to jail. And one of my neighbors where I grew up gave me a ride, and I was too embarrassed to have her take me all the way there. I had her drop me off at the corner of Route 91 and Lakeshore Boulevard because I didn't want her to see where I was going. She kept saying, well, I'll give you a ride. I'll take you there. I said, no, that's all right. And I remember I turned myself in, and the officer, detective, a lot of these people, we were on a first name basis after all these years. He said, well, what's this? And I said, well, if by some miracle I walk out of here, I showed him the want ads, the circles around all the places I was going to go apply that day. And I said, if not, I have my Bible to take with me because that's all I'm going to need there. And you could tell he was impressed. He pondered this for a few minutes. And then another interesting part of this story was when I finally had to go to court. And Pastor Greg may remember this day. By this time I had been in that court so many times. Most of the time it was just me. Nobody accompanied me. Well, that day when I went for the final time, the final case, I don't know if anyone remembers Judge Crane, a woman judge, but she was like a mother hen to me. You wouldn't just get a fine and jail time from Judge Crane. You'd always get that lecture too, that motherly lecture. And this time when I showed up, like I said, she wondered, I had my sponsor from the 12-step program on one side of me. Pastor Greg was standing on the other side of me. I'd already been coming to church here for several months. The front 2 rows were filled with members, who showed up in my support. All kinds of people from the 12-step program meetings that I had gone to. And Judge Crane asked me, at first she didn't pay any attention to the audience, just these 2 walked up before the judge with me. And you could tell she was kind of upset about that. She said, well, who were these 2? And I was just proud as could be to introduce. I said, well, Your Honor, this is a pastor from New Testament Fellowship I've been attending for the last several months every Sunday. This is a sponsor from my 12-step program where I've been going to 8 meetings a week for the last several months. And she said, well, who are all these people? And I said, they just came for support, Your Honor. And you could tell that this woman was just blown away by the statement that made. There was no doubt in this woman's life that some type of a change has occurred in this man's life.
That's right.